This is lesson 5 of the Sandhill Soaring Club Ground School. Today's topic is stability and weight and balance. So stability is the tendency that an aircraft has to fly straight at a particular speed without active pilot control. So it's the tendency of the aircraft to keep doing what it's doing. If an aircraft has too little stability, then it becomes difficult for the pilot to keep it flying straight and level. That's particularly bad on long trips. If an aircraft has too much stability, then it's difficult for the pilot to make it turn or make it change speeds. So it's important to keep the right amount of stability. Stability depends on the center of gravity being in the correct place. So weight and balance of the aircraft is the primary thing that determines stability. So we'll start by talking about some definitions of static stability and dynamic stability. We'll talk about some different types of stability which relate to the different axes of a glider. Then we'll talk about calculating weight and balance so that we can make sure that we are in the right range and have the right amount of longitudinal stability. And then I'm going to cover a topic which doesn't necessarily fit with stability and weight and balance, but it's an important topic that needs to be fit into the ground school somewhere, which is the topic of hazardous attitudes and what to do about them. So static stability is basically the tendency of something to return to its equilibrium state when it's disturbed a little bit. This example shows a ball where its equilibrium state is at the bottom of the hill in this first example, or the bottom of a valley in the first example. Positive stability exists here because when the ball goes a little bit up one hill, it's going to tend to roll back down towards its equilibrium point. The second example, it's an equilibrium at the top of this hill, but it doesn't have positive static stability because if the ball starts rolling down the hill, the ball will keep rolling down the hill. It won't go back towards its equilibrium point. So it would, in this case, to keep the ball at the top of the hill, somebody would have to actively manage doing that. Neutral static stability is just where there's no tendency either way. The ball gets displaced a little bit away from its equilibrium point. It's actually in another equilibrium point. It doesn't move back and forth. Dynamic stability, it requires static stability to even be, for there to even be a meaningful, whether there's dynamic stability or not. The neutral dynamic stability is where you disturb the aircraft from its equilibrium point. It tends to come back, it tends to overshoot, tends to come back again, overshoot again, and oscillate around the equilibrium point. The oscillations don't get bigger, they don't get smaller. It just keeps oscillating around the equilibrium point. Positive dynamic stability is better than that. It still oscillates around the equilibrium point, but it gets progressively closer to the equilibrium point each oscillation. The oscillations keep getting smaller and smaller. Negative dynamic stability is a bad situation where you get disturbed from your equilibrium point. You do come back toward it, so you have good static stability that brings you back toward it, but you overshoot and the oscillations keep getting bigger and bigger till eventually something bad's going to happen. So our goal with stability is to have both positive static stability and positive dynamic stability.
We'll start with the vertical axis, otherwise known as the yaw axis. Recall that yaw refers to whether the airplane is pointing in the same direction that it's moving with respect to the air that it's moving through. So in this picture, it starts in a state where it is correctly pointing in the direction of the airflow. Now suppose that some disturbance changes the direction that the glider is pointing so that it's no longer pointing into the airflow. In this situation, the air will strike the vertical tail at an angle, and since the vertical stabilizer is an airfoil, that will generate a side force on the tail. That side force will rotate the glider back so that it is once again pointed into the airflow. It acts as a weather vane. Next, let's consider lateral stability or roll stability. The terminology here isn't really consistent. Vertical stability refers to the stability around the vertical axis, but lateral stability refers to stability around the longitudinal axis. So here we have a glider, and a disturbance has lifted one wing and caused the glider to be in a bank. In the absence of any inputs with the rudder, the glider will enter a slip. This slip causes a restoring roll moment for several different reasons. We'll go through these one by one, but these are dihedral, tail position, wing position, and wing sweep. So when you look at an airplane on the ground, in some aircraft you'll notice that the wing tips are a little bit higher off the ground than the wing roots. That's true in many aircraft, but not all. When that is true, we say that that aircraft has some degree of dihedral. So with an aircraft with dihedral, then that horizontal component of the airflow tends to hit the bottom of the upwind wing, and it tends to hit the top of the downwind wing. So the angle of attack gets increased on the upwind wing and decreased on the downwind wing. That changes the amount of lift so that the upwind wing increases in lift, the downwind wing decreases in lift, and that creates a moment tending to roll the wings back towards level. Next, let's consider the wing position effect. So as the air flows laterally across the glider, it needs to flow around the fuselage. For a high wing glider like a Schweitzer 233, this flow of air around the fuselage causes the air flowing around the inboard portion of the upwind wing to be slightly upward flowing and downward flowing on the downwind side of the wing. That angle of attack change in that area causes a restoring moment, which will tend to make the glider roll back towards level flight. For a low wing glider, the effect would be the opposite. For mid-wing gliders, like most gliders, this is a very negligible effect. Next, let's consider the tail position effect. In a slip, the horizontal component of airflow will cause a sideways force on the tail. If the tail is above the center of gravity, which in most gliders it will be, this force will create a restoring moment which tends to level the glider. Now let's consider an aircraft with a large amount of wing sweep. Wing sweep means that the wing tips are located quite a bit aft of the wing roots. In this situation, that air, which is flowing a little bit diagonally because of the slip, will strike the upwind wing more directly than it strikes the downwind wing. That will cause the upwind wing to produce more lift and the downwind wing to produce less lift, which creates a restoring moment. It's uncommon for gliders to have a large degree of positive wing sweep. So the dihedral effect and the wing position effect, which tend to be the two strongest contributors to roll stability, both rely on this relationship between angle of attack and lift. They both rely on the idea that one wing is going to get a higher angle of attack and the other a lower angle of attack, and that's going to result in a change in the amount of lift produced. This graph shows how angle of attack is related to coefficient of lift, which is proportional to the amount of lift that the wing produces. Well, in the normal operating range that we fly in, there is a very strong relationship between angle of attack and lift coefficient. However, if we're operating near the stall angle of attack, then that relationship changes. It first flattens out and then actually starts to lift decreases with angle of attack when you get past the stalling angle. Therefore, when an aircraft is very close to stall, these two contributors to roll stability kind of stop working, and aircraft tend not to be very stable and roll right near the stall. This is why it's common when you do a stall for one wing to drop. All of the mechanisms that we just described that lead to positive static lateral stability involve the glider being in a slip. So when a glider is in a coordinated turn, that span-wise airflow that leads to the stability is not present, so the wings will not tend to level themselves. Furthermore, when you're in a turn, the outside wing travels faster than the inside wing. That increase in airspeed causes the outside wing to have more lift than the inside wing, which causes the glider to bank even further into the turn. That's especially noticeable in a steep turn. So when you're in a coordinated turn, especially if it's steep, you'll tend to notice that you actually need to position the ailerons against the turn in order to hold a constant bank angle. So we've talked about static stability in both roll and yaw. Now let's talk about dynamic stability. So the dynamic modes for yaw and roll are actually closely coupled to each other. So we'll talk about them together. The most common mode is called a Dutch roll mode. This involves, like, if you have a right roll, then part of that right recovery will end up causing a little bit of a right yaw disturbance, and then that recovery from that right yaw disturbance actually causes a little bit of a left roll, and the process goes back and forth a little bit. One of the certification criteria for certified aircraft is that the aircraft have positive dynamic stability for Dutch roll oscillations. So your certified aircraft, these Dutch roll oscillations should not get out of control on you without you having to do anything.
Okay, before I get into longitudinal stability, I need to have a little discussion about the concept of moments. So a moment is a force multiplied by a distance from a datum. So in this case, this is a datum we've defined it to be like the 0 point, and a force is getting applied some distance away from it. A moment is to rotational movement kind of what a force is to linear movement. It's the tendency of something to want to rotate. And you can apply the same tendency to rotate to something by putting a small force at a large distance or by putting a large force at a small distance. The effect will be the same on the tendency of it to rotate. So the moment is calculated by multiplying the amount of the force times the distance from the datum. In this case, 25 pounds times 10 inches, 250 inch-pounds of moment. In order to be balanced about a datum point, the moments have to add up to 0. So we've got this force is creating a moment of positive 250 inch-pounds. This other force of 50 pounds that's at a negative 5-inch distance is creating a negative 250 inch-pounds. Those add up to 0. So this would be balanced about this datum point. The center of gravity is the point about which all of the moments that are due to weights add up to 0. So when you have a bunch of different weights at different points in an aircraft, you can figure out the moment of each one, and if they add up to 0, then that datum means it's sort of equivalent to if all the weight was concentrated at that point.
Now let's consider pitch stability, which you may hear referred to as longitudinal stability. Let's look at the forces that act on the glider in steady state flight. So the center of gravity is located a little bit in front of the center of lift. The weight force acts through the center of gravity, and the wing's lift force acts through the center of lift. So that creates a downward moment tending to pitch the nose down. That has to be compensated by a downward force on the glider's tail. So the tail will, in steady state flight, be pushing down. Now suppose that there's some sort of a disturbance which causes the pitch attitude to increase. So when that pitch change happens, that will increase the angle of attack on the wing and cause the amount of lift produced by the wing to increase. At the same time, the angle of attack on the tail becomes less negative, which causes that downward force on the tail to become less. Both of those effects cause a nose down pitching moment, which will tend to restore the glider back towards its equilibrium steady state condition. Now while that is happening, that takes a little bit of time, and during that time the lift force will exceed the weight, so the glider will tend to start climbing during that time. Once it starts climbing, the glider will start to slow down. So those effects lead to one of the dynamic modes that we'll discuss on the next slide. Now let's consider the dynamic stability in pitch. There are a couple of different oscillating modes that aircraft have in pitch. There is a short period oscillation and a long period oscillation. The short period oscillation is something that is in the order of 2 to 5 seconds to oscillate with the nose up and down. And the certification criteria for airplanes is that the aircraft must have positive dynamic stability for this mode throughout the whole approved center of gravity range. So as long as you've got the center of gravity within the approved range, then the pilot doesn't need to do anything in order for this dynamic mode to settle down and everything go back to equilibrium. When the pilot does try to make corrections, the pilot can actually create a dynamic instability because the pilot's reactions oftentimes will be too much and too late. So the nose starts pitching up. By the time the pilot reacts to that by pushing forward on the yoke or the stick, the nose was already coming back down due to its own stability, and the pilot's input just causes it to go past the equilibrium mode by even more and create an unstable situation. This is called a pilot-induced oscillation. So the best thing to do if that starts happening is just to hold the controls steady and let things settle out. There's also a long period oscillation. This is related to the tendency of the aircraft to start climbing and slowing down while it recovers to its pitched attitude. This oscillation mode is much longer. The certification criteria is simply that the airplane not be too divergent to make it too difficult for the pilot to control it. So some pilot intervention may be needed to deal with that, but it is not difficult to do. As we discussed in the previous slide, the designer of the glider ensures that the glider will have acceptable stability whenever the aircraft is loaded within the design range for center of gravity. So now let's talk about what happens if you load a glider outside of the design range. So if the center of gravity is too far back relative to design range, then it's too close to that center of lift. As a result, the static longitudinal stability is decreased. You'll notice that the controls are lighter. This means that you'll have less tactile feedback through the controls for pitch changes, and you're going to have a harder time controlling pitch because you won't be feeling it in the stick as much. If you get the center of gravity too far back from the design range, you can get in a situation where recovering from a stall becomes impossible. Everything isn't bad. That downward force on the tail becomes less as the center of gravity moves aft. That means that the wing doesn't need to produce as much lift in order to counteract that downward force from the tail. This means that your stall speed will go down and that the amount of induced drag will go down, giving your glider better performance. On the other hand, there are bad effects to having the center of gravity too far forward. The positive benefits of an aft CG in terms of performance, of course, go the other way when you have the center of gravity too far forward. The wing has to generate even more lift, which decreases your performance. You'll notice that the controls are very heavy. It takes a lot of force on the control to make the aircraft change pitch attitude. If you get a long ways forward of this design range, you may lose control authority to the extent that there might not be enough control authority to make a flare during landing, and the glider will land in a nose down attitude.
So to make sure we have the center of gravity in the correct place compared to the center of lift, we need to be able to calculate where the center of gravity is. So we do a weight and balance calculation. The center of lift is not something we can do much about. That's something the aircraft designer has taken care of and has put it where they want it. So to do that, look at the weight and balance form, which should be kept in the glider. That will indicate the weight and the center of gravity location of the empty glider. The aircraft manual should tell us the moment arm for each seat. We kind of assume that the occupant's weight is concentrated at a particular point relative to the seat, and we get that distance by looking in the aircraft manual. So to determine the loaded weight, we add up the empty weight of the glider and the weight of the occupants. To determine the loaded moment, we have to multiply the weight of the aircraft and each occupant by the respective moment arm. Then we add those up. To determine the CG location, we divide by the moment by the loaded weight, and that gives us our CG location. And then we look in the aircraft manual to figure out if that is an acceptable CG location or not. I'll go through an example of this. So this is an example of a weight and balance form. They don't always look exactly the same. There's a few different forms, but this should be physically in the glider. It's required for the glider to be airworthy that this be there. In this form, somebody has put the glider on scales and calculated the amount of weight that was on the main wheel and the amount of weight that was on the tail skid, looked up the arm for the two and the moment for the two, and added it together and come up with the moment for the empty glider. They've also done some more calculations and calculated the useful load of the glider, which is the difference between its maximum weight and its empty weight. Okay, now I'd like to go through an example of that calculation for a full-blown weight and balance calculation. So our first step is that we find that weight and balance form in the aircraft, and that tells us our empty aircraft weight and moment. Then we have to determine the weights of the occupants in the front seat and the rear seat. Can ask them, or you could make them get on a scale if you don't believe them. Get numbers you sort of believe there. Add those up and you get the loaded weight, 1240 in this case. Then you go to the pilot's operating handbook, and somewhere in there you'll find the maximum gross weight of this glider. In this case it was 1280, and so since 1280 is larger than 1240, we are at an acceptable loaded weight. Now from the pilot's operating handbook, we can find the moment arm for the front seat and the rear seat. Notice that the front seat is a negative number. It's important to keep track of whether these arms are negative numbers or positive numbers. The manufacturer decides what they want to use as the datum, and as long as it's consistent, it doesn't really matter what they choose as the datum, but it has to be the same thing used throughout the whole calculation, and the same thing for the acceptables have to be relative to the same datum. Then we calculate the moment for each of the occupants by multiplying their weight times the arm. Notice that the rear seat occupant, the arm is really small. A lot of two-seat gliders are designed so that the rear seat is very close to the center of gravity, making the rear seat occupant have not very much effect on the center of gravity. Um, that's nice so that you can fly it solo or dual without, significantly different properties. The moments get added up to calculate the total moment, and then you calculate the overall arm for the center of gravity by dividing this number by the loaded weight. Comes out to 13.95. So we look in the pilot's operating handbook to see what the acceptable center of gravity range is, and we find that our loaded center of gravity is within those limits, so it's okay. We're good to go. This glider should have good longitudinal stability when we're in flight. Now in practice, we don't always have to go through the full center of gravity calculation every flight. With gliders, there's relatively few loading points. What I mean by that is points where we add weight. Usually it's just the one or two occupant seats where we add weight. For a lot of airplanes, there may be more than two seating rows. There may be multiple places where a cargo can get added, and there may be at least one and sometimes several locations where fuel gets stored. So the weight and balance calculation gets more complicated. But for gliders, typically there's just only the two occupants. And since the rear seat is usually very close to the center of gravity, it has a very small impact on the center of gravity of the loaded aircraft. So the result of that is you can kind of distill the whole weight and balance criteria for a glider into a couple of more simple criteria. Um, one being, the first being the minimum and the maximum front seat weight and the maximum total occupant weight. So if you meet those requirements, then you don't have to do a full weight and balance in order to know that the glider is going to be at an acceptable center of gravity. So now I'd like to continue on the aeronautical decision-making theme and talk about something called hazardous attitudes. When the FAA studied a lot of accidents and identified things that people had done wrong and why they did them wrong, they determined that there were several pilot attitudes that tended to crop up repeatedly and that tended to be associated with bad outcomes. Each of us is at least a little susceptible to each of these hazardous attitudes. But our different personalities, some of us tend to be more tempted by one or two of them, not so tempted by the other ones. It's good to know which ones you tend to be tempted by, and it's also good to pay attention to other people in the gliding club and kind of know which ones other people tend to be tempted by and watch out for them. So when we recognize that a hazardous attitude is starting to creep into our thinking, that can be countered by applying an antidote thought. So this is where we actively take control of our thoughts and say, I don't like the way I was thinking. I'm going to consciously have a thought that will counteract that tendency that was sneaking into my thinking. We do that with ourselves. It's also important in a group activity like in a glider club to watch out for hazardous attitudes in other people. And when you notice the hazardous attitude in the other people, instead of just thinking the antidote thought, uh, often good to actually express that antidote thought to that person. So there are 5 specific hazardous attitudes that have been identified as the most common ones that are problematic for aviation. The first one is anti-authority. The don't tell me what to do. I'm I'm in charge of what it's my decision, my life. You don't get to decide for me. Kind of an anti-rule. Impulsivity. People, I need to do something quickly. I don't have time to think about the right thing to do. I just need to. I've got a problem. I've got to do something about it. Another one is invulnerability. The idea that it will never happen to me. Um, Somebody can look at, you know, bad things happening to other people and feel like, well, that's other people. Um, that wouldn't happen to me. I don't need to worry about it. Then there's macho. The, the I can do it. I can handle things. I'm better. You know, other person made mistakes, or maybe the conditions are too much for other people, but I can do it. I can handle this. Last one is called resignation. The idea that it's kind of the opposite in some ways from macho. This is you know, things are out of my control. What I do won't matter here. What's going to happen is going to happen. We're just along for the ride, kind of. So the antidotes to each of these hazardous attitudes are, are for the anti-authority one, it's good to say, we better follow the rules. There's usually a good reason for these rules. Even if we don't know what that reason is, there generally is a good reason, so we should follow the rules. The antidote for impulsivity is to say, wait a minute, don't need to do anything so fast. Got time to think about this. There are some conditions that we really don't have time to think about, and we make a point of. That's why things like your pre-takeoff checklist has you make a decision about what you would do about rope breaks and different altitudes, because there isn't a lot of time to think about it. But most of things that has happened to us in flight, there is time to think about it, and we're better off taking the time to think about what's right rather than just being in a hurry to do something. The invulnerability is the antidote is just the opposite of the hazardous attitude thought. It's realizing it could happen to me. There's nothing special about me that makes me less likely to have this problem. Um, that you could, I'm not immune. Macho is to remind yourself that taking chances is foolish. Even if it is true that you're a better pilot than everybody else, it's still foolish to be taking chances as a pilot. So don't do it. Resignation, realizing I'm not helpless. I can make a difference here. I should continue thinking about what to do and doing it as long as I'm conscious.